Okay, so yesterday we learned a whole bunch of interesting different factoids that today the Gemara is going to explain better. So the first factoid we learned was we know that normally a carbon oila, the matnas dam that that, that apply to a carbon oila are shtei matanos shein arba. You go to two opposing points on the mizbeach, and our Brisa told us it was the northeast point and the southwest point. You put blood on the point, which spreads to two walls, and that's how you get two matnas dam, but they actually spread onto the four walls of the mizbeach. The first question that we need to answer is the 2 points that we pick are the northeast and the southwest. They're diagonally opposing points. The Gemara is going to explain today why isn't it the opposite? Why isn't the other 2 points? Why isn't it the northwest and the south? Why isn't it the northwest and the southeast? Why isn't it the other 2 points? So that's one question the Gemara is going to ask today. Another thing the Gemara is going to ask today is Rab Shimon HaMitzpah, Rab Shimon Ish HaMitzpah said that on the carbon tamid, it was a hybrid type of matnas dam, because by one point it was a matana acha shem shtayim. You put it right at the point, and it went onto two walls of the mizbeach. But when you get to the southwest point, there you apply the blood separately on the west wall of the mizbeach and then on the south wall of the mizbeach, which is similar to a chatos, where you put four matanos. So the question is, why does Reb Shimon hold of this hybrid arrangement? So those are two questions that we're going to have answered today. Additionally, at the end of the day, we had a machlokes between Abba Shaul and the Rabbanan about the order of the Hatavas Haneros versus the Haktaris. And at the bottom of Yud of Tesva of at the bottom of Yud Dalet Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom, the Gemara brought a brisa. Lo yetev es haneros va'achar kach yaktir. You shouldn't do haktaris after all of the neros. Rather yaktir, meaning first you're mative chamesh neros, then you make haktaris, and then you're mative the 2 final neros. So the haktara is in between the 2 hatavas haneros. The haktara is the avodah that's used to create a separation between the Tavas 5 neros and the Tavav Shnei neros. Abba Shaul said that the Haktara is afterwards. And as we know in the Brisa that we say every day in Karbonis, Abba Shaul used the Zrikas Dam HaTamid to be the mafsik between the Hatavas Chamesh neros and Tavav Shnei neros. So the first thing the Gemara is going to be focusing on is, where does this machlokes stem from? Do the Ketores, are the Ketores brought before the Hatavas Shtei Neros, like the Rabbanan hold, or are the Ketores brought after the Hatavas Shtei Neros, like Abba Shaul? So the Gemara probes, my time with Abba Shaul, what is the source for Abba Shaul to know that the Ketores is after the Hatavas Shtei Neros, after everything's all done? Dr. Gemara, the Chsiv, Baboiker, Beitivas Haneros. So let's see the pasuk inside. It says v'hikter olav Aharon Ketores Samim Baboiker. Aaron should be makter Ketores. When should he be makter Ketores? Beitivas Haneros. After his mativ deneros, then yaktirena. That's when he should. Be mativ. After he's mativ deneros, that's when he should be makter the Ketores. So that's how Abba Shaul says meitiv achach makter, because it says in the pasuk baboiker beitivus haneros, the hadar yaktirena, and only after that tavus haneros does the haktaris come. Rabbanon, Maika Amar Rachmana. According to Rabbanon, what does this pasuk mean? This pasuk seems clearly to indicate that the haktara is after that tavus haneros. Zakta Gemara beidun hatava tehei mikter ktaris. So the way he reads the pasuk is, the Hikter all of Aaron Kadari Saman Baboiker. When it, I'm stuttering on my words. Aaron should be Makta Katoris Baboiker. Beitiva Yasaneros, when he's mative the second neiros, the two neiros at the end, yakti rena, the ketores should already be in process. So not that the ketores you're makter after metivus neiros. Rather, it means while you're being mative the ketores, it should already be in the matzav of yakti rena, meaning the ketores should have been offered before the atava shnei neiros. That's how the Rabbanon are going to learn the pasuk. The Eden atava tehemakter as ketores. The Eloi Mahachi, I'm going to prove to you, your eyebrows gets raised when you first hear the interpretation of Rabbanan, to say that it means that the Hektaris was already in play when the two Neres were mutter. But I'm going to show you, Dr. Rabbanan, from other psukim, that's a first-class way to interpret a pasuk. The Eloi Mahachi, if you don't agree with this is how to learn psukim, so let's look at another pasuk. It says, "Uvahalois aharinas haneros bein harbayim." When Aaron HaKohen actually lights the neros, yaktirena k'toris tamid ofnei Hashem l'darisechem. So if you had Abba Shaul's approach, the way you would understand this pasuk is that after you light the menorah, then you bring the k'toris in the afternoon. The Gemara is going to prove to us that after the menorah, there are no things done in the Beis Hamikdash. So it's impossible to argue that you're makter the Ketores after that Lakas and Eres. So this pasuk, the only way you can possibly interpret it is, Uvahala is Aaron is Haneres ben Arbai Mekterena. It must mean that when Aaron lit the menorah, the Ketores had already been hooked around the Mizbeach. So that's proof positive that the approach that Rabbanan is taking in understanding the pasuk is a very legitimate shot in the pasuk, because we have proof that many psukim speak, or at least this pasuk also speaks that way. The loyte mahachi ben arbaim dechsiv uvahal is aris haneres ben arbaim yaktirenu hachanami. Are you going to want to argue the bereisha madlik neros that first you light the menorah v'hader makter k'torah shal ben arbaim, and only after the menorah is lit are you going to be makter the k'torah shal ben arbaim? And if you want to argue, in fact, that's the case, that you're makter the k'toros after you light the menorah, I have a proof from a brisa that you do not, the makter k'toros in the afternoon must be before the menorah is lit. And where do we know that from? Zok to Gemara, Vatanya, it says, Me'erev ad boiker. The menorah has to be lit, Me'erev ad boiker. So the pasuk quoted in full is Ba'oil Moyed Michus Taparachas, Asher Allah Edus, Yarach Oise Aaron Uvanav Me'erev ad boiker. Aaron Uvanav should set up the menorah, Me'erev ad boiker, L'fnei Hashem, Chukas Oilam L'dayoisam Me'es B'nei Yisrael. So what do we darshan from this Me'erev ad boiker? Ten Lamidasa Shedhei Delekas V'Lechas Kol Halayla Me'erev ad boiker. You have to put enough oil in each of the lamps so that the fire should stay lit all night long. And Rashi tells us, and how much oil is that? It's a half a loig for each ner. A loig is vav beim, so a half a loig would be 3 eggs. So it would be the content of approximately 3 eggs. How long does that last? We have the longest nights in the middle of the winter, and even on those long nights, this amount of oil will last you all night.
That's a big flame. A big flame needs so much oil.
Correct. Vim yoser biktsara yoser, and in the summer, where the nights are shorter, and therefore there's excess oil, let there be excess oil. But we had learned that one of the skills that the family who made the wicks for the menorah had was they adjusted the thickness of the wicks based on how long the night was. Since they always used the same amount of oil, and they wanted the oil to be depleted by the morning, so in the winter, where they had many hours that the fire had to remain lit, the wicks were manufactured a little bit thinner. And in the summer, where we wanted a bigger flame so that the oil should be depleted sooner, they actually made the wicks thicker. Dover Acher, But there's another shot in what we learned from this pasuk, and that's the focus of why the Gemara brought this brisa. Dover Achem Erev Ad Boker is Ein Loch Avoda Sheksher Me'erev Ad Boker. There is no other avoda that's kosher to be done during the period of Erev Ad Boker, during the period that the menorah is lit, Elazu Bilvad. When the menorah is lit, no other avoda should occur other than the menorah being lit. So, come to chois that if you cannot do any avoda while the menorah is lit, then you cannot do haktaris. So, from this brisa, you have proof positive that after the menorah was lit in the afternoon, you were not able to be maktar haktaris. So, if that's the case, when the pasuk says uvahalis aranis haneris b'navai maktirenu haktaris tamid, it can't be literal that the haktaris occurs after you light the menorah, because this brisa says quite clearly that after you light the menorah, no other avodas are to occur in the Beis Hamikdash. Let's hear Rashi. Ein lach avodas sheksher kloimer. Ein lach avodas yoim sheira achad lakosim. There's no more avodah that's supposed to be done during the day that's going to be kosher after you light the menorah. The Dor Shachi. The Dor Shachi is oisoi me'erev ad boiker v'loy acher me'erev ad boiker. Only the hadlakas of menorah is me'erev ad boiker, but no other avodah. So to Gemara, Ella Mike Omer, what does it mean? What must the pasuk mean? The Eden Hadlaka, when you light the menorah, the hey mikter ketoris, the ketoris should already be brought. Hachanami, so too, in the Rabbanan's machloikus with Abishol, the Eden Hatava, during the Hatava Saneris of the two Neris, the hey mikter ketoris, the ketoris should already be brought. Abishol Amalach, Abishol will tell you, in that pasuk, I agree that nothing can be done after the menorah. You know why? Because if you look at the pasuk, it says, Yarech oisoi ahari nivonov. Oisoi, this rule that nothing you could bring after, you cannot do any avodas hayoim after the menorah, that's a rule that applies only to the hadlakas of menorah. But other mitzvahs would not necessarily have that same rule. So I could preach this. Because it says oisoi, only the avodah of the menorah could be at that point. So we have no choice. So that forces us to understand the pasuk differently, that the ketoris had to have already been brought. Aval shachris, but the pasuk that we are discussing, Zok Bashol, doesn't have the oisoi. And therefore, the simplest way to learn pshat is that first you do the hatavas haneris, and only afterwards you do the haktaris. Okay, so let's scratch our memory a little bit, because how did we get to where we are? Well, what actually happened is that our Mishnah said that first you're meitiv the neiros, and then it says first you're mak to the ktaris, and then you're meitiv the neiros. That's what our Mishnah said. Our Mishnah said the order of operations of how the Kohen did the avodah during the 7 days was first makter ketoris and then meitiv neiros. The Gemara asked that the Mishnah in Talmud seems to contradict the Mishnah in Yuma, and the Mishnah in Talmud says that you're first meitiv neiros and then you're makter ketoris. And what our Gemara said is that our Mishnah is going according to Reb Shimon Ish HaMitzvah. And the Mishnah in Talmud is going according to the Tana and Talmud, who argues. Then the Gemara asked, we have a stira in our own Masechta, because our Mishnah indicates quite clearly that you first do the haktaris, and then you do the neiros. But the Gemara quoted Mishnayos later on in Yuma that talk about the payis, that talk about the order of the goyrel that they made to distribute the different avodas to the Kohanim, and the Mishnah there says, "Mi midasheles hamenorah." That was in the Pais Hasheni, and then only in the Pais Hashlishi is chadoshim lektoris ba'uva afisu. So now our Mishnah says, first you do ktoris and then you do atavas haneiros, and this Mishnah later on in Yuma says first you do atavas haneiros and then you do ktoris. So there's a stira muneu bay in Maseches Yuma, and the way Abai answered the question was kan ba'atava shtei neiros, kan ba'atavas chomesh neiros. There are two atavas. The atavas chomesh neiros preceded the ketores, but the atavas shtei neiros was after the ketores. And that's what brought us to this point. We got into Abai, we got into Abashol, but this all stemmed from the fact that we had a contradiction. Our Mishnah says that you first do Ketores and then Neiris, but the Mishnayos later on seems to indicate you first do Neiris and then Ketores. So the solution offered by Abaye was there's two Hatavas. There's one Hatava that's before the Ketores, and there's one Hatava that's after the Ketores. Now the Gemara wants to offer another answer to this contradiction in the Mishnayos in our Masechta itself. Rav Papa Amar Loi Kasha. Rav Papa said it's not shver. You know why? Ha Rabbanan Ha Abashol. Zokt Rashi, Rav Papa Amar Loi Kasha, say the Yuma, say the Yuma. This theory that we had in our own Masechta is not shver. Is not shver. The gears are a little bit funny over here. So we know that Abashol said that the Ketores is after the Hatava. Abashol said the Ketores is after the Hatava, and the Rabbanan said the Hatava is after the Ketores. So you can argue that our Mishnah that says that the Ketores is first and then comes the Hatava, that would be going according to the Rabbanan, and the Mishnah is later on that says that Ketores was after the Hatava, that would be going according to Abashol. That's what the Papa wants to suggest. So Loi Kasha, Ha Rabbanan, Ha Abashol. So Zok Gemara. So based on that, the Mayu Kimtel Masnis the Hacha. So our Mishnah that says that first is the Ketores and then there's the Hatava, that would be consistent with the Rabbanan. And Pius and the Mishnah at the end of Yuma, which says that the Ketores was after the Hatava, would be with Abashol. Zok Gemara, that's not going to work out so well because Ema Seifa. There's an even later Mishnah after the Mishnayos of Pius, later on in Yuma, that brings another case. And this is what it says. We know that the Kohen Gadol was very, very busy on Yom Kippur. He had to do so many avodas, so he was in a huge rush. And therefore, Kartzoi, he cut Roiv Bei Simonim, but he didn't completely finish the Shechita. Umerik Acher Shechita Al Yodoi. And another Kohen took over, or Shechita Ksher Bazar, somebody else took over and finished the Shechita. Zokt Rashi, Kartzoi Chatchai, he did the initial cut, the initial Shechita on the carbon. Chatach by Hechsher Shechita B'Rev Shnayim. He did enough that he completed the Shechita, but V'loi Kul, and he didn't completely sever the neck. Since the Kohen Gadol has to do all the avodas, he also has to do Kabbalah. Doing Shechita and Kabbalah is very difficult to manage unless someone else takes over at the end. Then Nichnas Lahakter Sektaris. Then he went to be Makri the Ketores, and then he went to Lehetavas and Neiris, Asan L'Rabbanan. So this is very strange because Reisha, the first Mishnah, our Mishnah, we're saying is going according to Rabbanan. Now this Seifa, the Mishnah at the end of Yuma, which clearly says that first comes Ketores, then comes the Tavas and Neiris, is going according to Rabbanan. Umitziyasa, but the Mishnah is that talks about Pius, where it says that the Haktara was after that Tava, is Abashol. Is that, and that's a little bit of an unusual setup. In Reisha, I'm not going to complain about that. In fact, the beginning of our Masechta, our Mishnah, is going according to Rabbanan. The last Mishnah discusses the Kartzu, Umorik Achar Shechita, is also going according to Rabbanan. And in the middle, the Tana switches to Abashol. This must be referring to the Hatavas and Neres of the final two Neres. Because there's no Tana at all that we can find that holds that the Ketores is brought before even the Hatavas Chomesh Neres. So Reisha V'Sefer said the Yuma Rabbanon and the Mitziyasa is going according to Abashol Bitmiya. Because why is that a problem? So Rashi, the whole Masechta Zu Kamish Nachas. Really, the whole Masechta is like one long Mishnah discussing one long subject. Shasuka Kula B'Seder Kamoy Sheina Psukim Sadur and V'Ochim. It's going through the order of operations of how the process was on Yom Kippur, according to the Psukim. So it's difficult at first glance to say that it's two different Tanoim and there's opinions changing in the middle. Zok to Gemara. Bishlam Abaye. So now we have a teretz of Abaye who says that one's referring to the two neirs and one's referring to the Chamish neirs. And one is, and we have a teretz of our Papa who says that one Mishnah is going according to the Rabbanan and one's going according to Abba Shaul. So they each had their own terutzim. Well, why didn't they like the other teretz? So Bishlam Abaye Amakra Papa, it's pretty obvious to understand why Abaye didn't like Rav Papa's answer. Because it's fair to say that Reisha v'Sefer Rabbanan and Mitziyasa Abba Shaul. So therefore, that's why he didn't want to shtel it ein, where the Mishnah should be going back and forth, representing one Tana and then representing another Tana. Ela Rav Papa, my time Abaye. Abaye had a very good teretz. One speaking about two neirs, one speaking about five neirs, and then you don't have to make it into machlokes. So what was the difficulty that Rav Papa had with Abaye's teretz that he wanted to pick a teretz that's much more difficult to accept? Amar Loch, he'll tell you, Tana Bereisha, Hatava Shtei Neiros, Bahadar, Hatavas Chamish Neiros. So let's think about it. Our Mishnah says that first you did Ketores and then you did Neiros, right? So let's think about it. If we're talking about the Hatavas and Neiros that's done after the Ketores, it must be referring to the second set of Hatava, the two. So it doesn't make sense to say that at the beginning of Masechta, it's discussing the second set of Hatavas and Neiros, and at the end of the Masechta, when it mentions that the Hatava comes before the Ketores, it's speaking about the first Hatava. It's out of order. So Rav Papa didn't want to learn our Mishnayos like Abaye, because according to Abaye, they're a little bit out of order. Dr. Rashi, Tana Bereisha, Bitmiyo, Doki Abaye Mesnisn the Perakama. Abaye is telling an our Mishnah, Hatava Shtei Neiros, which in fact occurs later. The Perak Sheni and the Perak of Pais, which has the Hatava after the Ketores, so which has the Hatava before the Ketores, is Hatava Seineres, which is the one that's brought earlier. That is difficult to accept. What is Abaye going to tell you? It's taka out of order. And this teretz actually Dovi Menzalewski mentioned yesterday. Maybe Uriye Ba'alma Hudakamari. Maybe the Mishnayos and Yuma are just telling us the individual halachas or the individual karbanas. But it's not talking about the exact order. The exact order, it reviews later on at the end. But each individual focus and each Mishnah is not necessarily following chronological order.
Well, the Dovi would have to explain why it chose that order.
Well, the Gemara would have to explain too. Why does the Gemara choose that order? The Gemara offered to do. So let's see what Rashi says. Vabai Amalach, Hai de Perakama, the Katani Kol Shivas Yom Huzer, which is our Mishnah. Lav Yom Kippurim Kai. It's not even talking about Yom Kippur. It's not even referring to Yom Kippur. As a matter of fact, we know it was talking about the 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. Sidra. There, the Mishnah in our Tana of our Mishnah wasn't concerned about following the exact order of the day. He was just focusing on this little section. The Tana is just right to teach us one detail. They're just trying to tell us that the Kohen Gadol has to do the avodas on the 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. So he should be used to it. But he wasn't going through the Seder of Yom Kippurim at that time. The Seder the Yuma, Hadutanila. And then the Seder of the day of Yom Kippur, the Tana leaves to the end of the Masechta. Because later on is where it's discussing the order. Here in our Mishnah, we're not discussing the order at all. Zok to the Margufa. So now we finished with the two terutzim to the Stira and Yuma. Either one's going according to Abba Shaul, one's going according to Rabbanon, or one's speaking about 5, one's speaking about 2. And in fact, the Mishnah is not focused in our Mishnah here, where the Mishnah is talking about the days prior to Yom Kippur. The Mishnah is not focused on the exact order.
Imagine the Kohen Gadol learning this block Gemara so that he could become familiar with the Avodah on Yom Kippur, right? And he's all mixed up because the order is wrong. And then we tell him, this review, right? Because the Gemara
No, it's
says
not a
that we're
problem.
reviewing.
No, it's not a problem because we tell him this Mishnah is not talking about the order, it's just focusing on this halacha. We'll get to the order later.
So why was it listed so that he should be familiar with Avodah? That's
No.
why it was listed.
No,
But it wasn't
no,
listed
that's not why it was
for
listed.
That's
That's not what Rashi says. He had to do the avodah. He had to do the avodah the week before, so he should be familiar. It's not in the Mishnah, so he should be familiar. So he should be familiar. He has to do the avodah, so he should be familiar.
So then it only remains what I said before. Why we picked this specific order. It doesn't help us.
That's right. So there must be a deeper meaning as to why put this order. They wouldn't Badaf do it wrong, right? They must have had a reason for it. I hear that must be. Gufa. So now let's go back and analyze Rab Shimon Ish HaMitzpah for his interesting order of how the carbon tamid blood was spritzed. Gufa. Baloi lekeren mizrachas tefillos. So let's close our eyes and imagine we're walking up the ramp. The ramp that goes up to Mizbech, when you're walking up that ramp, you're actually walking from south to north, which means to your right will be the east, and to your left will be the west. So baloi lekeren mizrachas tefillos, which means when he got up to the top of the ramp, he made a right turn, and he started walking counterclockwise. And the very first corner that he's going to hit is going to be the southeastern tip, where he does not put any blood. He skips that, and then he makes a left turn to head north in his continued counterclockwise motion, and he goes up to the top of the Mizbeach, and he's now at the northeastern point of the Mizbeach. So baloi lekeren mizrachas tefillos. Noisein mizrachas tefillos. He then puts a drop of blood on that point, which spreads onto the east wall of the Mizbeach and onto the north wall of the Mizbeach. Then he continues on in his counterclockwise motion. And interesting enough, when you're going counterclockwise, his first turn off the Mizbeach, he turned to the right. But every other turn along the way, he's actually turning to the left because he's going in a counterclockwise motion. And I once heard a shir from a Reisman of Flatbush, who gives the shir Manovi a whole shir as to why things are counterclockwise. And he actually brought in, when the Torah talks about the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, it also describes it in a counterclockwise motion. And he says that when we dance on Simchas Torah, when Yidden dance, we always dance in a counterclockwise motion. And he had a whole shir on it. It was very interesting. But anyway, so when he's going around the Mizbech, he's going counterclockwise. And then he goes around, he skips the northwestern tip. He continues there until he comes down to the southwestern tip. And at the southwestern tip, Noisin my Rabbis Teremis. The Tana Kama says you just put one point the same way you did by the northeastern tip. And that one point, the blood splits and goes to the south wall and to the west wall. However, Vatani Allah Rab Shimon Ish HaMitzpah, Meshane B'Tamid. He said even though normally a carbon oila, the matnas dam is exactly as described by the Tana Kama, but for the carbon tamid itself, there was a deviation on the second hazah. So by the first hazah, the kerem mizrachas tefillos, noisim mizrachas tefillos, exactly as per a regular oila. But when he gets to the maravas deraimis, then he splits it into two matnas dam. Noisim ma'arava, he first puts dam on the west wall of the mizbech, v'yachach noisim draimo, and then he puts on the south wall of the mizbech. What is the reasoning for Rab Shimon Ish HaMitzpah to deviate from the normal process of zrikas adam of a carbon oila, which the carbon tamid is? Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Chadevei Rabbi Yanai, Rabbi Yochanan took over in the name of somebody from Rabbi Yanai. The Torah says, Usir izim echad lachatos lashem al oilos hatamid Yosy in Iskai. This is the end of the little parsha of Rosh Chodesh that we learn in Rosh Chodesh. So it says as follows: Oilahi, it's an oila, v'omer achmona ovid b'masachatos. Because it says, so we're talking about an oila, and the Torah is telling us we should treat it somewhat like a chatas. Haketzad, how do you treat an oila somewhat like a chatas? In one corner, he does one matan on the point, which splits into two sides, which is like an oila, and then shtayim shem shtayim k'maisa chatas. But the second point, he makes it into two separate zrikas, which is like the chatos, because we know the chatos needs a separate matana on each side. So therefore, it's half like an oila and half like a chatos. Velitain Shtaim Shein Arba Kamaisa Oila, but Arba Shein Arba Kamaisa Chatas. Why do you do half and half? Why don't you do the full Zrikas Dam of an Oila and then repeat it with the full Zrikas Dam of the Chatas if you want to do both? So you never find, Zok Rashi, you never find that you double up on the matnas tam. Frek the Gemara, what you're suggesting is also something that's unprecedented. Elamai, why are you doing something unprecedented? Because the Torah specifically tells you to do something unprecedented. So so maybe the Torah means to say that you should do two matanos, two sets of matanos. Zok to Gemara, no, what we're suggesting is not as bad, because Hasam Pisuk matanos ba'almahi. We're not doing double matanos, we're just splitting it up a little bit differently. It's not such a radical change. And that's why we suggest to go this way, rather than have two sets of matanos. For Gemara, v'nesev achas she'ishtayim lamata k'maisa oila and shtayim she'ishtayim lamayla k'maisa chatos. The halacha is when you spritz dam on the mizbeach, the carbon oila you spritz on the lower half of the mizbeach. There was actually a line on the mizbeach that separated between the top half and the bottom half, so it would be clear where the top half is and where the bottom half is. The oila, you normally spritz the blood on the lower half. The chatos, you normally spritz the blood on the upper half. So if you're trying to create a hybrid between oila and chatos, well, then if that's the case, then you should spritz some of the blood above and some of the blood below. That's again unprecedented. Are you telling me you never find a Zrika Saddam where some is above the half of the Beach, so top half, and some is on the bottom half? But none. It says he's a mimenu. This is on Yom Kippur, where we have the Hazos, the Achas, V'achas, and it says he's a mimenu Achas L'mayla V'sheva L'mata. Zok Rashi, he's a mimenu L'kama Pek Chamishi Kishu Maza Midam Apor Keneged Ovia Shal Kapayos. When he's spritzing on the Kapayos by the Oren, the Kosol Kadaitach Achas Me'em to Ovia L'mayla V'sheva Mem Ches L'mata. The Havamina is that what the Mishnah means when it tells us Achas L'mayla V'sheva L'mata, it means that, let's say the Kapayos, the top of the Oren was, let's say, 6 inches thick. So one of the Zrikas would be on the top 3 inches of the thickness of the kapar of the top of the urn of the kaparius, and the other zrikus would be on the lower half. So tomorrow, no, it's kematzlif. It doesn't mean when it says achas l'mayla achas l'mata, it doesn't mean where you're spritzing on the mizbeach. It just means your hand position. Are you pointing up or are you pointing down? Kematzlif hai lamata ulamayla the tani lo yam tzokoi. It's not going on the middle of the Orin of the kaparius, and the question is where the blood's supposed to land, on the top half or the lower half. The first one he spritzes in the upper direction, which will hit higher, and the lower ones you line up that they should land on the Orin a little bit lower than the one above it, but they were not one on the top half and one on the bottom half. My kamatzlif, what exactly does matzlif mean? And Rashi actually says, I don't even know what the word maslef means. Mochi Rabbi Yehuda kimenagdina. Rabbi Yehuda showed with his motion, with his hand, how it would work. And Rashi says, kimenagdina kishlich bezdin namaka bertzua zula matamizu. When the shlich bezdin is giving malchus to the victim or to the perpetrator, so he doesn't whip in the same place. He sort of lines it up like when we put on our tefillin, when we take off our tefillin, we have like lines on our hand, one beside the other. That's what kamatzlef means. The lashon matzlef loy noideli. I don't know exactly what the lashon matzlef is, but what it means to say is you'll see 7 drops of blood, one below the other, and that's what it means. But not necessarily achas lamata v'shel lamata above the half line and below the half line. Once again, are you saying you never find where some blood is above the half point and some blood is below the half point. But Tanan, we learned, Hiza mimenu al tahare shal mizbeach sheva pamim. He would spritz, again speaking about this rika that was done by the mixed blood, and it said he spritzed that on the tahare shal mizbeach sheva pamim. What is the definition of the word tahare shal mizbeach? So the Gemara in the Havini says, "My love apal the mizbeach." The tahara in the mizbeach means the center line of the mizbeach, and the reason why it's called tahara is because it's referring to an afternoon. Kida amri inchi tahara tiara, who palga the yoma. So harai and palga the yoma, the afternoon is the demarcation point between the morning and the afternoon. V'chivin the sheva hazoyis hazeh. V'chivin the sheva hazoyis hiza hamazeh. Since the spritzer spritz 7 hazoyis. It's impossible if you're spritzing on the halfway mark of if your target is the halfway mark of the height of the Mizbeach, it's impossible to land 7 bullseyes exactly at the halfway mark. So it's inevitable that some drips are going to land slightly above that halfway mark, and some drops are going to land slightly below the halfway mark. And since it's impossible to do it any other way, it must be that you see that you could have Zrikas Tam, some above the half and some below the half. It's actually talking, the Tahari of the Mizbeach doesn't mean the side of the Mizbeach, it means on the top of the Mizbeach. And why is it called Tiyar Reish al Mizbeach? Rashi tells us is because you have to clean away the ashes and anything else that's on the top surface of the Mizbeach so that the blood will actually hit the actual Mizbeach itself, not some ashes that have accumulated there. And like a pure sky that's not clouded, which means any obstruction has been moved out of the way. Now the Gemara is another shayla. What was Reb Shimon Ish HaMitzvah's order? The first zrika was done like an oila, one on the point. The second half was like the chatos. Maybe do the opposite. Maybe the northeast should have been one on the north wall, one on the east wall. And when he came around to the southwest, then he should have just made one at the corner. Why is the oila process first and the chatas process second? So that's logical. Even the oila he called mabaresha. An oila which is going completely to Shemayim, completely to Rebbeinu Shalom, it makes sense that oila should have precedent. In fact, why do you pick those 2 diagonal corners? Pick southeast and northwest. Why are you picking those 2 corners? Pick the other 2 corners. When you spritz dam on the mizbeach for the carbon oila, the pasuk tells us that it has to be in a place where the mizbeach has a yisoid, and the yisoid, the one amma of the yisoid that the mizbeach had, did not completely wrap around fully all 4 sides of the mizbeach. And the keren deramis mizrachis lo have a yisoid. The southeastern corner of the mizbeach did not have a yisoid, so that's why that corner is disqualified. Once that corner is disqualified, automatically its opposing corner would be disqualified as well. Why did you first put blood on the northeastern corner and then on the southwest? Why did you do the opposite way? That's because we follow the normal route that somebody goes around the mizbeach, which is counterclockwise. Since we know that when you come up to the top of the mizbeach, we want you to turn to the right. That's where you want to go. So by definition, you're now going in a counterclockwise motion. So therefore, Bereisha Bahupaga, you're going to hit the northeast corner before you're going to hit the southwest corner based on your chosen route. And that's why this is the order. Freit the Gemara, the Torah has, in the pasuk says, we learn it from the pasuk that the Gemara quoted, that usir izim echod lachatos lashem al oilos atomid yes v'niskay. The pasuk is talking about an animal that has an oil and chatos in it. Well, how do you know that the Torah is referring to an oila and telling you that you should treat the oila a little bit like a chatos? Maybe we're talking about a carbon chatos. The chatos of the kamar chmana over the ma'isa oila. Maybe don't apply this to the carbon tamid, which is an oila, and give it features of a chatos. Find the carbon chatos somewhere, like the sir chatos of Rosh Chodesh, and treat it a little bit like an oila. Clearly, the Torah is saying, take an oila and treat it somewhat like a chatos. Mike Amar Achmana, midi the chatos shadia oila. Take some features of the chatos and put it on the oila. Tell us we learned. Amar len hamamuna. The Mamuna in the Beis Hamikdash said, so in order to understand this, we have to get a little bit of an understanding of what was going on, the order, the architecture of the Beis Hamikdash. So imagine you have your big rectangular azara, and to the left side you have your Beis Hamikdash, your Kodesh Kodashim, and then to the right is the open area of the azara where you had the Mizbeach and the open area of the azara. If that's how you're looking at it, at the top, somewhere to the right of the Beis Hamikdash, was called the Lishkas Beis HaMoikid. It was a very big chamber that straddled the wall of the Azara. Half of it was in the Azara, and half of it was actually north of the Azara, out of the Azara. And this big room is a place where there's a fire, where Kohanim would warm up there. And in this big room, in this big chamber, each of its four corners were sectioned off, and there was a mini chamber in this. So you have a huge chamber that has four corners. It's rectangular, and in each corner of this chamber there was a smaller square chamber, almost like a keren on a mizbeach. And they would say, "Go get a tle that we're going to shecht as a carbon from the lishkas beis hatloim, which we once discussed that they always had a reserve of 6." Animals that were being checked for a mumen, and they were checked over 3 days, so they constantly had a supply of tloim that didn't have a mum. So they would say, go and bring a tle from that room. That room, that mini lishka where these tloim were checked, was one of the 4 rooms in this big lishkas beis hamoikid. Where was it? So the Mamuna would say, lishkas hatloim hoised b'miktzayit tzefonis ma'rovis. The northwestern Lishka, in this big Lishka's Beis HaMoikid, the northwestern one, that's where you would find the Lishkas Hatloim. So Zok to Gemara, Va'arba Lishkas Hoyusham. There were 4 chambers in this big Lishkas Beis HaMoikid. Achad Lishkas Hatloim, the northwestern one, as we just said, was where they prepared the Tloim, the sheep for the carbon tamid. Va'achas Lishkas HaChisomis. One was the Lishkas HaChisomis. We learned that when someone had to bring a mincha, he would go to the cashier, he would give them the money that they needed for the particular mincha, depending on how big it was, and then they would give him a soda ticket, right? They would give him a ticket to indicate that this is what you paid for, and then he would go to the person dispensing the flour and the oil to buy it from him with the soda ticket. So where did this fellow put all these soda tickets? Because at the end, he had to do a reconciliation with the cashier. There was his room, one of the 4 rooms is where they kept the soda tickets. The achas lishkas beis hamoikid, one little room that had a fire in it. And one room was the room where they prepared the lechem upon. There were 4 rooms in this Beis HaMoikid, like small little chambers that are opened up to the big chamber. Being that this big Lishkas Beis HaMoikid straddled the wall of the Azara, so 2 of its lishkas, which were in 2 corners, which were in the south corners, were inside the Beis Hamikdash, inside the Azara, and the 2 in the north, which were outside the Azara walls, were choil. They were small posts lined up across the demarcation point between where you're in the Azara and when you're out of the Azara, because you were allowed to sit down out of the Azara, you were not allowed to sit down in the Azara. So they actually had a demarcation so people knew where they were. Okay, so we'll finish this tomorrow. The Gemara is going to drill down into exactly what these forums were used for and what position they were in. I guess we could stop here and we'll be mamshuk tomorrow. Shkoyach.
Yosy, what did Rabbi Elephant say about why they rotated around the Mizbeh?